Good evening and welcome. I am Mistress Anna Alicia von Reinhardt, and this is Basic Smocking. I hope that you will enjoy the presentation this evening. The first thing I wanted to talk about was just a little bit of history. Smocking has been around actually since the Viking Age. The oldest extant textile fragment that we have is from the 10th century Denmark. So it was on one of the smokers, the apron dress, and it was right around the bust line. And it was done in this herringbone stitch that you see here on the apron. Now to prepare to do your smocking, actually what was smocking used for? They would take the excess fullness of a garment that oftentimes was either belted in or pulled in using a gathering stitch, and they started making pleats, and then they would embroider on top of the pleats to hold in and control the fullness. And sometimes what they needed was for that pleated fabric to be able to move, to be able to expand, and that is very much what this herringbone stitch is used for. And you'll see it here also on the front of the neck edge here. Again, the herringbone stitch. It's kind of medieval elastic, kind of magic stuff. So in order to prepare fabric for pleating, the first thing that you would need to do is to create a grid line. So you would decide how far apart you want the grid line. Most medieval and Renaissance garments were pleated on either an 1/8 inch or a 1/4 inch grid. This happens to be a 1/4 inch. And if you were using a very thick or heavy fabric like a heavy wool or a velvet, the pleats could be even as far apart as 1 inch. As you can imagine, that's going to give you a very, very thick, substantial pleat, and might not necessarily be used on clothing so much because it would be very, very thick. But, you know, possibly around a cloak or the base of a hood or somewhere else where you would want to control all that fullness. Then you have to gather it up. So let's see, on the end here, this is the pick up dot method, where you just go in and pick up every single little dot all the way across. Another method, you can see here in this sample, is going down at one dot and up at the next dot to create the pleats. Once you have everything pleated, you need to pull it in to whatever size you need. Like this here is a wrist. This section of pleating will be in the middle of my forearm, and then there's another just below the elbow. So each section of pleating will be progressively a little bit larger so that it'll fit all the way around the arm. And that's how they were able to control all the voluminous fabric and sleeves, around the chest or high necks. And the stitches that I wanted to show you tonight are the most basic stitches, so don't be intimidated. This is not difficult stitching, and it goes surprisingly quick. Now, you should always make a sampler of the actual fabric and an embroidery floss that you plan to use. Different people embroider with different tensions. Some like to pull it fairly tight, others leave their stitches a little more loose. And so this gives you an opportunity to play with it a little bit, and also with the thickness. See, this one is 1/4 inch pleated. So you can determine before you commit to a full garment exactly how you want it to look. And this one has been taken out and repleated and restitched numerous times. until I was happy with it. This was the final sample. As you can see, it matches in with this one here, with the red section. So, when you're getting ready to stitch, for those of you who might not have a lot of experience with embroidery, I like to pull a skein of the floss out from basically the top of my hand down to about the elbow. That gives you a nice approximately 18-inch length of floss to work with. Most flosses come with 6 strands, and I'll be working with 2 strands this evening. And you should always use some kind of a thread conditioner. This one is Thread Magic. This one is Thread Heaven. And this one is actual beeswax. Beeswax is a very period way to coat and condition your flosses so that the weave of it, the twist of it, will lay smoothly as you are embroidering. And that reminds me of one other small detail. When you're looking at your floss, I don't know if you can see that, it's very, very light. It's a light brown. But you'll be able to feel which way the fibers are laying. One direction will be a little more rough, the other direction will be smooth. And that's the direction that you want to be able to pull it in so that you're not roughing up your floss as you embroider. And if you're doing this test and you don't really feel anything, loosen your fingers to where you're like almost about to drop it. Because the tendency is to want to, you know, grab onto it so it doesn't go anywhere, because they're very light and they tend to fly. Alrighty, so this is the sampler that I have the directions for in my handout. If you have not yet taken a look at the handout, it's in the files here on this page, The Story of Maisie and Kern. And it gives much more history than I have, and it goes much more in depth into different fabrics, flosses, how to make your grid. But since we only have a short amount of time this evening, I mostly wanted to focus on the main stitches that you would need to get started. So this first one is your basic outline stitch. It's used in many different kinds of embroidery. It's very, very simple. You have your thread above the needle. Now when you're getting ready to smock into the pleat, if it's not separating easily, you can put your needle in there to separate the pleats, because sometimes they're pretty tight together. You can also use your thumbnail, get in there, and separate them out. You won't mess it up if you're pushing it for just a moment. Now you want to stay in a nice smooth line, and in this way the gathering stitches, you can see down in there, see the little gathering stitches, they can help you stay on a line. Or even if you're working between the lines, if you're keeping the same amount of space between this one and this one for a middle section of stitches, it'll keep you going in a straight line. So the outline stitch is very simple. I'm staying right here along this path. You'd put the needle in from right to left, keep the thread above the needle, and bring it straight on down. And then again, keeping it above the needle. Take a nice stitch right across that basting line. You do want to be careful about your tension. If you pull it too tight, the gathers are going to pucker. And if it's too loose, then it's not going to hold at all.
So how do you know what the right tension is?
You need to play with it. That's why you need your sampler. Because different thickness of material and different types of floss, this is just a standard cotton DMC floss. But if you're using linen or silk or even wool threads, they are going to work up differently, and some are thicker, some are thinner, obviously. So that's why the sampler is so very, very important. And if you're not happy with it, take it apart. There's nothing that says you have to leave a mistake in there unless you want to. And also with this one, I probably tore this out and tried it about 4 different ways before I was happy with it. And this was over the course of maybe a couple of weeks. And then once I chose my final thickness of floss I was going to use, I was happy with the depth of the pleats and the way the beads were looking inside the gathering stitches. Then I moved on to working on my chemise sleeve. So I'll just tuck that one back up in there. And then the next stitch is the stem stitch, and it is the exact opposite of the outline stitch. Now you can see my first one, I started going off a little bit, and this one is a little thicker than this one. This is using 3 strands of floss, but I wasn't paying attention, you see, and so it started going uphill. I easily could have picked that out and created a perfect sampler for you to use, but I thought I'll just go ahead and leave that mistake in there because it is so easy to kind of get off the line that you're intending on. So there is a little bit of precision involved. You just need to pay attention to what you're doing. I was probably distracted by one of the cats or something. So this time the thread is going to be below the needle, and again separate out the one pleat that you're going to be working on. Make sure that you're in line. And go ahead and take that stitch. I'm about halfway down that pleat, or maybe a little bit less. You can see down in there. Yeah, actually maybe about 1/4 to 1/3. You don't want a real big bite down into the pleat because you're just going to be wasting floss and it's going to make the stitches look kind of weird. So you just need a little bite right across the top. And this one's gotten hung up on a needle down there. And you can use your fingernails to kind of ease them into position. They get off a little bit. Get the cat hair out of there. I don't know how many times I've sewn cat hair into my garments. That's one of the joys of owning cats. Or do they own us? Sometimes I wonder. You see, it's easy to get into a rhythm and work it pretty quickly. And again, every now and then, take a look at your work. See if they are staying on the line where you want them. Make sure you're not pulling them too tight. See that one right there? That one was a little too tight. See how it's kind of squishing in? So instead of taking it all the way back there, which I could do, I could also just use the needle and loosen up those stitches until I get back to that spot. And you go back to tighten them back up. It's easier to use your fingers. That's a little better. Now, you can put the outline stitch and the stem stitch together, and you create what is called...
Sorry.
Are we back?
Yeah.
Farrar touched something he shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when you have the outline stitch on top and the stem stitch on the bottom, it creates what's called the wheat stitch, sometimes also called the mock chain. And That's the same stitch that I used here to secure the pleats top and bottom of my gathering. This is a wheat stitch. And then on the back of the pleats, I used a nice sturdy hand sewing thread and just did a simple outline on the top and on the bottom, just to secure those pleats on the back and make sure they aren't going to go anywhere. You'll also find in extant garments that they, excuse me, that they lined the back of the pleats, oftentimes around the wrist, around the neckline, or up around the top of the neck like a collar. And you would just simply use another piece of linen, or even a more fine linen, especially if you're using something that's a little thick already. You probably want something that's more of a lining fabric weight. And obviously finish off all four of your edges. You can lay it down on top of the back of your pleats, and then use a hem stitch or an outline stitch, whichever kind of you like, but just make sure that you catch every single little pleat across there, and that will protect the back of it, especially if it's you know, kind of a heavy or easily soiled area like around the neck. So here with the wheat stitch, again doing the top section of it, the thread is above the needle. Trying to make sure you're going in a line. Okay, we'll stop there for the moment. Normally you would not have all the needles and threads in all the different aspects of your work, but this was just so that you didn't have to wait for me while I was tediously trying to thread a needle. So to complete the wheat stitch, then we will go back in right next to the outline stitches that I just did. You want it as close as possible. Remember, this is the stem stitch, so whoops, darn it, there it goes. That the thread is below the needle. Give me a moment. And don't worry, that happens all the time as well. You get used to it. So once again, going in, finding the very bottom. You want them as close to one another as you can make it. And again, if you're not happy with it, take it out, do it again. And so as you can see, that is beginning to form that kind of a mock chain look to it. Of course, as they also call it, the wheat stitch. I prefer the terminology wheat. Either one is correct, but just so that it's not confused with the regular chain stitch in embroidery. And then moving on, pardon me, this is the stitch that everybody wants to learn. It is it's fun. It's a little fiddly. Again, just keep your mind on what you're doing. This is the honeycomb stitch. It's the same one that you saw in the apron, and the same one that is in the collar. And that's the one that stretches. It's like medieval elastic. Excuse me. And of course the tutorials for all of these are also in my handout. So if I'm going a little too fast for you, don't worry. Just download the handout and you can take all the time you need. If you have any questions, if you get stuck on something, you know, please send me a message through Facebook, or my email is also at the end of the handout, and I'll be happy to help you out. So here we go with the honeycomb. Now actually, to begin this, on the right hand side of the pleat and go through to the left hand side of the pleat. Why they want you to start it off that way, I don't really know, but there you go. So the first stitch, you're going to keep the thread above the needle. You're going to come in 2 pleats right next to where your thread came out before. Okay. So to come back in, you come in on the right hand side of the pleat. This is the little fiddly part. You want to come down that pleat, and then looking where your gathering threads are, if that's how long you want that stitch, then you want to come out left hand side. I beg your pardon for my gravelly voice this evening. Right on the left hand side of that pleat. It's going to come right down the channel. This one is also a favorite in children's garments, and you get kind of a shadow effect in between the rows of stitching. If this was a stronger color, like a bright blue or a dark red, you would be able to see that little shadow color right in between them. So you would have these alternating rows of a shadow color and then whatever your base material is, and it gives a really pretty effect. Alrighty. And now with the thread above the needle, you're going to find the line that you're working with. There's my gathering thread. So you're going to come over another pleat. Wait, let me think a moment. Even I have to go back and look at the instructions for this one. I've just put the thread down below my needle, right out next to where you came in, not the exact hole, but like maybe a thread up from it. And that one was a little snug. Loosen that up a little bit. Okay. And then from the right hand side of that pleat, and you're going to go up the channel, and you're going to come out on this left hand side right next to the other stitches. See that?
So when you say that goes up the channel, the needle essentially is going up.
Yes, it's going inside of the little pleats.
Okay.
And then again, you're going to come over to find your gathering thread. That's the line that you're following across the material. Take a little bite. You want to come right back up next to where the thread came out. And then again on the right hand side of that last pleat, down the channel and out on the left hand side. And again, don't tug too tightly. And you'll see that this is forming this pattern here. And when all the gathering threads are taken out, then you're going to be able to accordion like this one. Let's see if I can bring these back together. So that's how it looks when you finish stitching it And then, of course, it has that lovely expansion and gives you that wonderful honeycomb look.